Over the course of naval history, some ships burned bright and fast. They would enter service and almost immediately be thrown into combat. And not only would they be thrown head first, but the ships would end up sunk in short order. Perhaps in one battle, perhaps in a couple. Either way, they would end up on the bottom in under a year. Even by this standard, there are few ships that burned as hot and fast as Teruzuki, one of the first Akizuki-class destroyers, and a ship with only a couple months of active service. So short, in fact, that I'm unaware of any surviving photographs of the ship. At least photos that can be 100% confirmed as this ship. I'll be using her sister ships for this video as a result. A shorter video since there's simply not a lot to cover for better or worse. Though the design details are, as always, something I can touch on real quick. In this regard, Teruzuki displaced around 2,700 tons at the standard loading. This rose as high as 3,700 tons when fully loaded, quite large by the standards of Second World War destroyers. The weapons, on the other hand, were smaller than average. 4 twin turrets, each carrying 2 100mm guns, 1 super-firing pair on the bow, and another pair on the stern. A total of 8 barrels in all, of what the Japanese considered their best dual-purpose weapon. I have a video on that topic that I'll link in the description. Unlike most Japanese destroyers, on the Akizukis, those guns were the main focus. Teruzuki only carried a single quadruple torpedo mount amidships. 4 tubes, though she did have a single set of reloads, so 8 torpedoes in all. Beyond this point, it was the usual 25mm anti-aircraft guns. Since Teruzuki was sunk relatively early in the war, she only had a handful. Exactly how many isn't clear. At least 4, possibly a few more. Unfortunately, her wreck is too badly broken to identify how many. In any event, her weaponry was rounded off by the usual depth charges on the stern, which brings us to speed to finish this section off. That was a good enough 33 knots on 50,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. Right, that finishes off the design details, so let's shift over to Teruzuki's abbreviated service history. This story began on November 13th, 1940, when Teruzuki was laid down at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki. The destroyer would have a fairly speedy construction period, with the hull launched a year later, November 21st, 1941. This was, of course, only a couple weeks before Pearl Harbor, nowhere near enough time to finish before the Pacific War kicked off. As it turned out, Teruzuki finished her fitting out over the course of 1942, with the destroyer completed on August 31st of that year. Though completed simply means the fitting out stage. Teruzuki had another month or so of working up to go, from September 8th to September 30th. It was only in early October that the destroyer properly joined the fleet. On October 7th, 1942, she joined Destroyer Division 61. Although division is perhaps being a bit generous. It was only Teruzuki and her sister Akizuki. As a general rule, the Japanese preferred to keep sister ships together. See, for example, the 4 Akatsukis often serving as Destroyer Division 6. This is relevant because in October 1942, all of 2 Akizuki-class ships were complete. Akizuki and Teruzuki. There wouldn't be another Suzuki until the end of December. That aside, those 2 destroyers would leave Japan on October 10th, 1942, first to sail to Truk and then on to the Solomons. In this, Teruzuki joined up as part of the escort for Japanese carriers sailing to join the Guadalcanal campaign, more specifically for the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th. During this battle, Teruzuki was part of the escorts for Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho. The destroyer put her fancy new 100mm guns to good use, of course. Teruzuki fired salvo after salvo at attacking American aircraft in an attempt to protect her charges. Unfortunately, no amount of defensive fire would be enough. Both Zuiho and Shokaku suffered damaging hits during this phase of the battle. Though in fairness, the Japanese would cripple Hornet and damage Enterprise in turn. That aside, Teruzuki evaded any damage of her own, at least in this phase. Later that night, the destroyer was attacked by a PBY Catalina, of all things. This didn't directly hit Teruzuki, but the bomb was close enough to still cause minor damage. Details aren't clear on how much damage, but the ship did lose 7 crew. One Japanese source cites the starboard side of the bridge being hit, with the 7 lost crew joined by a further 36 wounded. Regardless of where she was damaged, Teruzuki was forced to return to Truk for repair work. She would arrive there on October 29th and take up position with the repair ship Akashi. How long those repairs took is similarly not clear. It couldn't have been long at any rate, because Teruzuki set sail again on November 9th, 1942. This time as part of the escort for a bombardment force, centered on the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. This force would arrive off Guadalcanal on the night of November 12th. In a classic pattern off that island, the Japanese force would run into an American formation. Thus would the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal enter its first phase. This was a chaotic affair, to say the least, as I touched on in my video on Yudachi. I've looked into every source I could get my hands on, and cite where relevant who claims what. This battle is a mess, and figuring out exactly what happened varies widely on who you're reading. I feel it's important to the historical record to include all relevant information and claims, while of course noting where it conflicts. For Teruzuki, it initially began quietly enough. She was at the rear of the Japanese formation, and as a direct result, missed the initial salvos of the battle. It was only as the formations began to split apart that Teruzuki joined in properly. She was part of the escort for the cruiser Nagara, along with the more famous Yukikaze and Amatsukaze. While the battle was, as noted, chaotic, it's commonly cited that Teruzuki's first contribution was engaging USS Cushing. Cushing had just passed near and fired upon Hiei, only to run into Nagara's little group, which promptly took her under fire. Cushing suffered terribly from multiple directions and ships, with Hara citing Teruzuki doing most of the damage. The other Japanese sources will cite Yukikaze instead, with Teruzuki finishing Cushing off. O'Hara also cites Teruzuki engaging Atlanta at some point during the early stage of the battle. Now, to this point, the destroyer had been putting her guns to use. However, Cox cites the potential of a torpedo hit. When Laffey's stern was hit by a torpedo, he cites that it might have been Teruzuki, but that it could also have come from other ships like Nagara or Yukikaze. Hara also cites Teruzuki, though without the might qualifier. Hamill cites Teruzuki as well. Meanwhile, Combined Fleet goes for Yuki-kaze. Torpedoes are especially difficult to nail down in a melee like this, so make of that what you will. Sources like Lundgren even suggest it might have been friendly fire. Beyond this point, it becomes harder to nail down what Teruzuki was actually up to. Cox and O'Hara note the ship helping to fire on USS Monson, along with Nagara and Yuki-kaze. This is rather unlikely based on most other tellings of the battle, because most sources will counter with it being Asagumo, Samidare, and Murasame wrecking Monson. This is pretty consistent across sources, though I won't say solely newer sources. Cox is from 2020 after all. Nonetheless, while Teruzuki might have fired on Monson, it was Asagumo's trio that did most of the work. Regardless, it's a mess as I said. Take, for example, many sources citing Asagumo's group also wrecking Laffy. Others will instead opt for Yuki-kaze and Teruzuki based on ship positioning during the battle, both in gunfire and the aforementioned torpedo. The next commonly cited task was crippling USS Sterett. Both O'Hara and Cox cite this. Sterett was pounded by enemy fire to be sure, and retreated to relative safety. Hamill goes a bit further, citing an unexploded 3.9-inch or 100mm shell recovered from a flooded compartment. Furthermore, the rate of fire, clustered hits, all point to Teruzuki for Hamill. However, there is some dispute on this particular topic. I've seen reference to that being a common theme in this battle, Teruzuki being credited for what Yuki-kaze did. Combined Fleet, for its part, doesn't specify either way. As I noted, Yuki-kaze is credited with probably torpedoing Laffy, but the article is quiet on Sterett, while Teruzuki's article cites the ship claiming hits on 7 enemy ships without specifying which ones. Regardless of how much Teruzuki did and how much was actually Yuki-kaze, sources agree on her role in the battle coming to an end here. She would retire from the combat zone, escorting the crippled Hiei. Teruzuki did her best to provide air cover, but it wouldn't be enough. Hiei would ultimately be sunk by persistent airstrikes. As for Teruzuki, she remained in the area and would join up with Kirishima. The following night, November 14th, she would join the other Japanese warships in pounding poor South Dakota. How much Teruzuki's relatively small guns did is something of an open question. Regardless, she would evade damage during this engagement. Kirishima was not so lucky. She would be crippled by USS Washington, leaving Teruzuki to join rescue operations as the crew was pulled off. This was dangerous work, and at one point, it looked like Kirishima would capsize on top of Teruzuki. Fortunately, this wouldn't happen, but it was certainly a scare. With Kirishima's survivors on board, Teruzuki retreated from the area. Ultimately, she would be back at Truk by November 18th, and remain there until early December, including striking a reef on December 3rd. This damaged a prop and required some repair work. Minor repairs as it turned out, because Teruzuki was back at sea on December 5th, 1942. She sailed first for the Shortlands. Once there, the destroyer was assigned to join a Tokyo Express run to resupply Guadalcanal. This would, however, not happen. Heavy resistance from American forces saw this particular attempt abandoned, leaving Teruzuki back at the Shortlands until December 11th, when she set out on her final voyage, another Tokyo Express run. Teruzuki was the flagship of Admiral Raizo Tanaka, joined by several other destroyers. This formation would arrive off Savo Island at around 10:45 p.m. on December 11th. Just before 11 p.m., the Japanese ships were ambushed by PT boats. Once more, sources will differ on which boats and how many were involved. Combined fleet cites PT-37 and PT-40. Cox goes for PT-40, PT-45, and PT-59. Regardless of which boats or how many attacked, Teruzuki was hit in the stern. 2 torpedoes hit the destroyer, 1 in the aft engine room, while the other blew off the port prop and rudder. Teruzuki came to a halt, ablaze from ruptured fuel tanks. The destroyer would be abandoned when the fire started to spread and threaten the aft magazines. At 1:15 a.m. on December 12th, the order to abandon ship went out. Traditionally, at this point, the story goes like this. The fires reached Teruzuki's depth charges around 2:40 and blew the stern apart. Her stern was blown off, but not by the depth charges. Nautilus found the detached stern, and while it's rough, half of the depth charges are clearly visible here. Teruzuki wasn't sunk by her own depth charges. Now it is possible that one went off here on the other side, but it's tough to say if that's explosion or rust damage. Regardless, 9 of the crew went down with their ship, while 197 men were plucked from the water, and a further 156 swam ashore. Teruzuki's story came to an end here until her wreck was finally discovered by the Nautilus team on July 10th, 2025. But that's a story for another day. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.